Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians and friends of Ukraine around the world. Today is Tuesday, December 23rd, 2025. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest for today's episode is Michael Bohnert, an engineer and defense researcher at RAND, which is a U.S. nonprofit global policy think tank. Welcome, Michael. How are you?
Good morning. Never a dull moment before Christmas.
Never. Thanks so much for joining us today. To start off with, can we talk a bit about your educational and professional background?
Sure. I'm a mechanical engineer from University of Notre Dame and a systems engineer from the Pennsylvania State University. And my professional background, I started as a civilian engineer at the U.S. Navy in electronic warfare many years ago. Then I transitioned to the Navy Nuclear Lab doing design of nuclear propulsion systems. And now I've been at RAND for over 10 years, where I focus on a combination of kind of acquisition and capabilities of defense systems, looking at both the technical capabilities, the industrial base, and then future employment of these systems.
So, in your defense analysis of world conflicts, you have taken a particular interest in Ukraine. Why?
Well, so previously, actually, I'd taken interest in the conflicts in Syria and Sudan. One issue with those conflicts is it's very difficult to really understand who has a path forward to stability and the crisis ending. Whereas in the war in Ukraine, it's a very clear-cut case. There's an aggressor, there's a defender. The defender, Ukraine, is trying to join the West, and it has a pathways to end the conflict and end it on its terms.
Do you think Ukraine can win against Russia in the current war? And if so, why?
I believe Ukraine definitely can. Ukraine, it has significant combat capabilities in an industrial base. It has that legacy from the era of the Soviet Union. It's also on the defensive, which being on the defensive always provides advantages over the attacker. Um, in contrast, Russia does have a finite ability to fight. It has vast stocks of Soviet legacy equipment, as well as its own industrial base. However, ultimately, it is attacking Ukraine. It is expending many resources, and it cannot go on indefinitely. Ukraine may not be able to regain all of its territory, at least as part of this initial war, but it definitely can militarily stop Russia and defeat it for the conflict. So not leave it as frozen.
In a recent Wall Street Journal article, you discussed Ukraine's drone strikes on Russia's energy infrastructure. Do you think these can have a significant impact on the course of the war?
So if performed in significant volume, these strikes definitely can have a significant impact. It's not about money or the economy. It's a simple fact that without fuel and without refined products, it's very hard to make a military move, the logistics and the battlefield operations. Without fuel, tanks cease, the trucks stop moving, and all of the trains and other supplies to the front halt. Additionally, from the military side of the industrial base, it requires fuel to move the equipment around, and it requires many refined plastic products and other sort of oils and rubbers that are derived to produce military equipment. So by going after the fuel infrastructure or oil refineries, it means that it hampers logistics and Russia's industrial base at the same time. That being said, it takes a lot of volume of attacks to do that. Russia can absorb 20, 30%-ish of fuel reduction before it really starts to see the impacts. As we saw a couple months ago, once Russia had below about a 20% reduction, the effects really started to trickle throughout the economy quite quickly in some areas.
Russia's Trans-Siberian Railway is a critical logistics artery for the country, and it's increasingly utilized to transport Chinese supplies, dual-use goods, machinery, drones, possibly some military components, and other resources, while also moving military assets from the Far East to Ukraine, to the war front. Have you seen any significant efforts by Ukraine or Russian insurgents to disrupt this supply route?
So we've definitely seen where some attacks have occurred. The areas that where the railway becomes narrow down to just the single pathway is very far from Ukraine. It's hard to strike. And historically, it takes a lot of effort to damage rail because it's low to the ground, it's steel, it's very hard to hit. And Russia understands the vulnerability for years and has significant ability to repair rail. There are bridges that are single points of failure along the Trans-Siberian Railway. However, they are very far from Ukraine, and it takes a lot of effort to bring down bridges. One other comment is, while there are many shipments from China coming over the rail, many more are coming through Kazakhstan and other roadways via truck for a variety of reasons. Part of it's for volume, part of it's access to China, but there is a significant diversity in pathways of these Chinese supplies into Russia.
How vulnerable is Russia to drone strikes on its major cities and airports?
So in the cities and airports directly, actually not very much. Attacking population centers rarely alters the outcome of a war. We've seen this numerous times over the past decades. Population centers are vast. It takes a lot of damage to impact them, and airports themselves tend to have very low impact on wars, especially given Russia's infrastructure being so vast. And Ukraine just simply lacks the mass of strike capability to really see an impact on cities. However, Ukraine does have significant ability to hit critical aspects of Russia. So fuel, logistics, and power infrastructure immediately around industrial logistics hubs. So from a constrained perspective, Ukraine can have a lot of impact on parts of cities and the industrial areas, but on the cities and airports as a whole, not really.
How vulnerable is Ukraine to continued Russian attacks on its energy infrastructure?
So power plants and refineries take a very long time to repair and rebuild. However, energy distribution, so like the transformers, the power lines, can be repaired more quickly. I mean, overall, Ukraine is very vulnerable. There is a finite number. There are finite locations that have power plants. However, Ukraine has the advantage that it is close to neighboring countries that can import some electricity, but it will definitely continue to be difficult for Ukraine to maintain energy supplies. I'll be blunt on that side.
Michael, how vulnerable is Ukraine to continued Russian attacks on its energy infrastructure?
Well, Ukraine is vulnerable to many of the attacks. So air defenses, there are only so many, and they can't be everywhere. And Russia has started to use a little more variety in where they attack. That being said, one main advantage that Ukraine has is multiple neighboring countries that they can connect their energy infrastructure to, whether it be gasoline or whether it be electrical grid, diesel as well. So it definitely could be very difficult for Ukraine, especially in the winter. But overall, Ukraine has demonstrated their ability to do quick repairs, and that has been supported particularly by European allies.
What does Ukraine need to do to improve its air defenses? Is it possible to do this with current weapons commitments from Europe and the US?
So Ukraine basically faces four distinct threats right now. So the traditional one are ballistic missiles. Then there are the Shaheeds, which are the slow propeller-based drones. There are jet-based drones, or jet-based missiles like cruise missiles, and then finally aircraft that want to get overhead. So there's some overlap in how to defend against them, but there also are some differences. So on the ballistic missile side, for Ukraine, the only option really is the Patriot missile that's made in the United States. Europe makes a few missiles that are somewhat comparable, but those are made in the dozens per year, and Ukraine needs hundreds, if not thousands per year. When it comes to cruise missile defense and protecting against the drones, Ukraine does have a lot of options. So there are many videos where Ukraine has been using machine guns and other, as we would say, small arms to shoot down the slower propeller-based drones. That works very effectively, although it only defends a very small area. Basically, whoever's holding the gun can defend themselves, so they have to be co-located with the building. There are some European efforts, particularly out of Estonia and Sweden, that have been particularly cost effective, where they're cheaper than the Shaheeds and the Garan drones, where the missiles that are being produced by those countries are very good against those particular threats, and that's starting to scale up. I have a feeling those will be new commitments made soon, and there have been some other systems. One of them that's more famous is the Vampire, but those have been very good at hitting those drones. The cruise missile and those jet-powered missiles, that's a little trickier because something needs to be a little bit faster. So those need a missile to hit those missiles. So this is where that Vampire can do a little bit. There are more European options. That's where systems like the Iris-T out of Germany has been very, very effective. Multiple European companies have been ramping up production of those, but the numbers still aren't enough overall, but they're getting closer to meet that demand. One gap that isn't really talked about is Ukraine needs long-range missiles to keep fighters away. So fighter aircraft early on in the war were very easily hit by Ukrainian long-range surface-to-air missiles. Over time, those fighter jets have been equipped with what are called glide bombs. So the fighters can stay further away and drop bombs into Ukraine or against Ukrainian troops. The only real way to get them is either with another aircraft or with long-range missiles. Now, with other aircraft, Ukraine simply does not have enough. They're getting donations, but there's not the volume of them necessary to protect the entire boundary of Ukraine with Russia. And when it comes to longer range missiles, really only the Patriot has the range now, and those are needed for ballistic missile defense. So when it comes to everything but ballistic missile defense, there are European options because Europe can donate more fighters, can provide more missiles for that aircraft threat. So there are options within Europe. But when it comes to ballistic missiles, really the Patriot is the only option.
Michael, unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but I do have a final question. Other than the current strikes by smaller drones and the yet to be observed employment of the Flamingo missile, what options exist for more effective Ukrainian strikes?
So Russia is now employing a jet-powered version of their Garan drone using a commercial jet. It's small, it's a little bit slower, but it's basically using a 1980s, 90s airframe and jet frame. There have been some similar proposals by European companies, as well as American companies to produce those sorts of lower cost, kind of moderate capability drones. That's something where I believe over the next couple of months, we probably could start seeing those employed, and there definitely could be a significant ramp up in that capability. There also are a variety of air-delivered short-range cruise missiles, so about 250 nautical miles, that also are starting to see production. So those are two areas where European suppliers have the potential to really increase their volume of supplies to Ukraine. There hasn't been a lot of talk about those yet. I'm not entirely sure why, but once again, there's a lot of smaller commercial jet engines that can be used for these kind of lower capability drones. But as I mentioned earlier, the one advantage they have is they're faster than what guns can shoot down. Now, they're very vulnerable to missiles, but they tend to be cheaper than many of the missiles that Russia's employing. So I do think these kind of lower cost jet drones are the next thing that supporters of Ukraine can provide. We just haven't seen a lot of it yet.
Michael, thank you so much for joining us today on Krynica.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's wonderful talking to you.
I have been speaking with Michael Bohnert, an engineer and defense researcher at RAND, a U.S. nonprofit global policy think tank. This episode of Krynica was produced for the Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. And I'm Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynica. Until next time, that's all for now.